Executive Director of Creating Accessible Neighborhoods, CAN. I'm a white non-binary person with freckles and silver glasses. CAN's logo, website, and email are shown on this slide. Our logo is orange and features four heads, arms outstretched and circling one another. Our website is www.canbc.org, and our email is info@canbc.org. I have described myself and the image on this slide to model how to be more accessible for participants that are partially sighted or blind. I will be describing all images in this presentation. Captions are available if you'd like to turn them on for yourself. You can go to the live transcripts. Angela,
Heather,
did you want to say something?
I just want to ask if you wanted to go full screen or presentation mode.
Sure. One moment. Here.
Awesome, perfect.
CAN operates on the stolen land of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We recognize that this acknowledgement is a tiny piece in the larger context of the ongoing work that is necessary in order to challenge the legacies of colonialism and create palpable disruptive change and true reconciliation. CAN was initially created as a grassroots organization in Maple Ridge and Pitt Meadows, following my personal experiences with ableism and inaccessibility. After not leaving my house unless for medical appointments for several years, I was excited to finally have freedom with my new power wheelchair. However, when I tried to access transit, bus drivers, about half of the time, lied and told me the ramps weren't operating because they didn't want to take the time to deploy the ramp. I'm shown on this slide in my wheelchair at a bus stop next to a bus. This type of gatekeeping, denying access to accessibility features, is unfortunately a common experience in many areas of life for disabled people. I wrote several letters to TransLink trying to address this issue, but did not hear back. I tried to get an organization to help me, but none were interested. At the time, I was running a chronic pain support group, and a member laughingly said that I should create my own organization. I looked into it, and in 2005, I founded CAN with members of the chronic pain support group as my first board. Once incorporated, I wrote the exact same letter to TransLink, this time with executive director under my name, and received a response a week later. I worked with TransLink and discovered that they actually had a policy addressing this issue that I had been experiencing, but passengers and drivers were not aware of it. We did an education campaign and supplied passengers with copies of the policy, and we were able to resolve the issue of bus drivers gatekeeping access to the bus. News of our success spread, and CAN was flooded by disabled people who had other access issues. So examples of projects that CAN took on, we were raising awareness through the media. We're well aware that having a media presence is a very important part of advocacy work. We've had a presence in news stories in Vancouver Sun, the province, on TV, BCTV, CTV, Global, Omni, and Radio, CBC, regarding accessibility and inclusive design. CAN has used the print media multiple times to bring attention to issues that affect people with disabilities. We've also been on CBC Radio several times to promote the need for accessibility. We've also featured in stories on local news shows, mainly regarding accessibility on the transportation system. A large part of advocacy is making sure that others are aware of the issues so that they can join their voices with ours in order to create positive change. CAN has also worked with politicians, planners, and staff in several municipalities throughout Metro Vancouver. We gave presentations that educate and enlighten. We've worked one-on-one with planners on specific projects. We've advocated directly to politicians for better awareness about the need for improved accessibility. And we worked within focus groups and regional growth strategy forums on projects that affect the various municipalities. CAN was contacted by several residents when we first started in 2005 in Maple Ridge and Pitt Meadows who were frustrated that there was no adaptive sport and recreation programs in the two communities. CAN advocated on their behalf and was able to secure funding as well as a gym for a power soccer team, which the players dubbed the Ridge Rockets. CAN members then coached and volunteered to support the team for several years. A parent of one of the power soccer players is a web designer and provided their services to CAN. We were impressed by the reach that the website has. We've been contacted by people across Turtle Island, also known as North America, regarding a variety of accessibility and disability issues. We've also occasionally been contacted by people further afield. So for example, a professor from Nagoya University in Japan contacted CAN to ask about accessibility in Metro Vancouver. We were able to meet with the professor when she visited Vancouver, and we took her on an accessibility tour and demonstrated what a person with a disability deals with on a daily basis and why accessibility is so important. The professor has remained in touch. Creating Accessible Neighborhoods also created a disability awareness workshop for directors and chairs of the Maple Ridge Pitt Meadows BC disability games, including 10 tips on interacting with athletes with disabilities and current and outdated terminology. The disability awareness sessions were well attended and very effective. Many of the volunteers spoke of their experiences during the game when they utilized what they'd learned within the awareness activities. And those who applied the training to the games experience came away with interactions that were much more comfortable and at ease. They also reported that they shared what they learned in the disability awareness workshops with people outside of the game experience, including at home, in other volunteer positions, and at work. Following the first few years of growth, CAN continued to increase our reach and enhance our reputation, and we started taking on projects throughout the province, including offering feedback to bus companies on Vancouver Island, the interior, and Metro Vancouver. CAN also works with BC Justice Institute, consulting on and creating content for the disability awareness section of their taxi driver training and ride-hailing driver training. Transportation issues were why we initially founded CAN and remain a priority. As CAN interacted with more communities, we realized there was a lack of education about life with a disability. So we created and delivered workshops, seminars, and presentations at conferences across the province. We utilized our members' lived experience to help shape and shift perception of people with disabilities. This slide has a photograph of a group of people standing on a street corner. This was an accessibility tour we gave for the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference to demonstrate the difficulties of navigating streetscapes in downtown Vancouver. CAN has been and continues to be sought out as consultants by government, business, communities, and nonprofits for projects that cover a broad range, including accessibility, transportation, disability awareness, advocacy, poverty, and more. In addition to consulting for and educating businesses, organizations, and communities about life with a disability, CAN began to advocate on behalf of individuals, communities, and groups. We started partnering with other organizations to work together to create palpable change through reports, policy, and community building. In the first few years, CAN contacted individual businesses on behalf of members to educate about accessibility. We realized there was a growing interest for accessibility audits, so we educated ourselves about best standards in Canada and throughout the world. We developed our own audit tool. For the first few years, we started with individual businesses. For example, we were hired by the Arbutus Club in Vancouver to do an accessibility audit of their facility. We gave recommendations and created a frontline staff accessibility guide that included information on the accessibility of their facility and tips on how to improve attitudinal accessibility, which is customer service. In the lead up to the 2010 Olympics and Paralympics, CAN was busy and hired for many projects. This included working for several years for 2010 Legacies Now to do on-site inspections of businesses throughout Vancouver. We were also hired by YVR, Vancouver's airport, specifically for parking, including drop-off zones and entrances exits. We were also hired by the Vancouver Organizing Committee, VANOC, to assess accessibility of venues used for the Olympics and Paralympics. CAN has been involved in the City of Burnaby's neighborhood audits for several years. Burnaby has been utilizing the SWAN tool. SWAN stands for Stakeholders Walkability Wheelability Audit in Neighborhoods. This tool was created by students and professors at the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University. CAN acts as a consultant for several projects at both universities, this tool being one of them. CAN started due to issue with TransLink. Our relationship has continued over the years, including being hired to perform access audits. The audits have been on a variety of features, including bus loops, bus stops, and routes to and from bus stops. We have also audited the vehicles of Coast Mountain Bus Company, and CAN audited the accessibility of the Evergreen line prior to its opening. Most recently, CAN did an accessibility audit of the Polygon Gallery in North Vancouver. We also delivered disability awareness sessions and Gender and Sexuality 101 educational session for staff. Community building is important to CAN. One example of community building working is when TransLink proposed a change to the 49 bus route that threatened to sever access to the Champlain area, a neighborhood with the highest percentage of older adults in Vancouver, as well as a large population of families with children and people with disabilities. This slide has a photograph of passengers inside a bus. TransLink had an online survey that most in Champlain were not aware of. TransLink also held an open house outside of Champlain with extremely low turnout. The majority of residents were not aware of the open house or of the proposed change. The feedback at the open house did not properly address the concerns of those who live in Champlain area. The survey was also only available in English, which is an accessibility issue. CAN talked TransLink into providing us with paper surveys. We then had volunteer interpreters who helped us get additional surveys filled in by people who found the online version inaccessible. Creating Accessible Neighborhoods also talked TransLink into letting CAN hold our own open house hosted within Champlain. We used grassroots advertising and community to get the word out. Our open house had over 100 people, meeting the maximum occupancy for the venue. The Vancouver Courier wrote an article and a local councillor became involved. TransLink put off the change to the route. This lasted for 2 years, then they came back and made the change. While it is frustrating to see that the change did eventually occur, severely impacting people within Champlain, we still consider it a win that we were able to delay it for 2 years. We proved that the community is capable of mobilizing, coming together to save something that means a lot to the residents of that community. Part of how CAN educates about life while disabled, and all that includes, is by speaking at conferences. Examples include Accessible Urban Space, a facilitated discussion on inclusive communities at the UN World Urban Forum, employing people with disabilities in the tourism sector at Social Planning and Research Council's Access Awareness Day Dialogue, Understanding Disability and Universal Design at Kamloops City Fit for Children, Accessible Transportation System at both the Connecting Communities Youth Summit and as a keynote speaker for TransLink's Access Awareness Day. Disability awareness for frontline staff for City of Burnaby staff. Rights of disabled people for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Enabling people with disabilities with assistive technology. And this was at the Innovate conference, Innovate standing for Innovations in the Northwest to Advance Assistive Technology Excellence. And we did 2 presentations at Walk 21. The first was Evolution of the Pedestrian, and the second was a walking tour with disabled people on examples in universal design. For 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, CAN's executive director, myself, wrote a monthly column for the Maple Ridge Pitt Meadows Times. Each month focused on a fundraiser for a specific health issue with an interview with someone who lived of that health issue. It raised awareness about disabilities, how they affect people differently, how the majority are not evident by appearance, and what people can do to destigmatize disability and health issues. We heard from many people who said they didn't know how to start conversations with family members about health issues, and the column helped give them that to speak on their own experiences. Throughout 2016, Creating Accessible Neighborhoods was routinely contacted by people with disabilities who felt like they had no voice or power within the province. People had participated in the 2014 government consultation, but felt that their comments and feedback were ignored, written into papers, and just filed away. In response, CAN developed a survey for people with disabilities on assistance and also for ministry workers. CAN then co-authored a report with Omar Chu of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. The report was entitled Sharing Our Reality, Life on Disability Assistance in British Columbia. The report focused on the demoralizing effects of provincial government policy for both people with disabilities and those that work within the income assistance system. The report included recommendations to increase the disability assistance rates, simplify applications for income and disability assistance, and return to a system with individualized caseworkers. The report looked beyond the numbers to focus on real life stories. So for example, Frank, who receives disability assistance, shared the messages that we don't have enough for basics like food and shelter, and this makes our disabilities worse. We are losing our health, we are losing our homes, we are losing our lives. There is a crisis. Income assistant workers agreed and highlighted how they did not feel that they had avenues in which they could share their thoughts and concerns about their ability to do their job. Doug Kinna, a British Columbia Government and Service Employees Union elected representative for Ministry Social Workers, said income assistant workers tell me all the time how powerless they now feel to actually make a difference in people's lives within the current service delivery model. The stories in the report demonstrated the inadequacy of disability assistance and appealed to the government to provide a system based in dignity for people with disabilities. This report generated much needed conversation and led to improvements within the income assistance system. CAN also worked with multiple organizations to co-author Shifting the Culture at the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. This paper was a brief overview of key concerns regarding the ministry. The examples provided are achievable measures that would better reflect the support and assistance the system is supposed to be providing people with disabilities and those on welfare. The report shared the organization's vision, which is a ministry that is dedicated to poverty reduction should be designed to meet the needs of people currently living in poverty and help them lift them out of poverty. We envision a culture of care instead of a culture of suspicion, with better training and supports for staff and a serious commitment to accessibility for clients. An accessible system should not require the help of an advocate to apply, make a call, and/or address an issue. Such a ministry would be a respectful and supportive environment where somebody needing support can walk into an office and meet face-to-face with a worker who treats them with dignity and respect. Work with us to come up with tangible, time-sensitive changes to the culture and accessibility of the ministry. Commit to an ethical, dignified assistance system that works to actively lift people out of poverty and end poverty altogether. CAN's executive director, along with other co-authors, participated in a phone call with deputy ministers regarding the paper and the steps they are taking to address the issues laid out in the report. The government was responsive to the report and made some much needed change. CAN's direction has been shaped by need. As we gained members, visited more communities, and spoke with more disabled people, community members, and advocates, we realized where there is a need for our work. From a grassroots organization that started from a single issue in 2 communities, we've grown into an organization that has projects throughout the province, and thanks to the increase in accessibility during the pandemic, we've had projects throughout Turtle Island, North America. This slide has an illustration of a diverse group of people, including several people with disabilities. As we grew, we saw that there was a gap in representing disabled people with multiple intersecting identities and how that affects access, equity, and participation. We heard from members that they could be part of themselves in certain spaces, such as queer in queer spaces or disabled in disabled spaces, but never felt like they could bring their entire being comfortably into most spaces. We recognize that the majority of our members live with intersecting identities that are not properly acknowledged or represented. These identities include income level, gender, sexuality, race, and age, among others. CAN also recognizes that geographical location really impacts one's ability to access services and support and truly be oneself. CAN began to work to educate about and model how to create spaces where people can be themselves fully. CAN aims to build and celebrate community. CAN also started working with organizations, individuals, and fellow consultants in the 2S LGBTQIA+, queer and trans community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. CAN made a commitment to centering decolonization and uses both an intersectional lens and a disability justice framework. We're committed to educating others as well as ourselves, utilizing every possible learning opportunity and gaining knowledge from the fellow consultants who are doing amazing work. CAN understands that we can't truly liberate one group until we liberate all. This includes facilitating Chronically Queer, a support group for 2S LGBTQIA+ folk with chronic health conditions. Chronically Queer provides a welcoming, supportive environment where 2S LGBTQIA+ people with chronic health conditions and or disabilities can come together and share what is happening in their life. When I started facilitating Chronically Queer in 2018, it was run under community. From the start, I noticed that there were issues with ableism and inaccessibility, including the training and their office being in an inaccessible location with stairs but no elevator. As Chronically Queer met, I learned more about the ongoing issues and how many group members felt that the organization only represented one part of who they were, the queer and or trans person, but not the disabled part. Members started advocating for themselves, trying to bring about change. In 2019, we had a group who participated in the Vancouver Pride Parade to show queer, trans, disabled representation. This slide has a photograph of 7 chronically queer members with signs in the Vancouver Pride Society Parade. Signs include, I am a lesbian, I have an invisible illness, I am proud, spoiler alert, disabled people can be queer too, and queer here and a pain in the ass for medical and gender systems everywhere. We were part of Community's group. Unfortunately, despite a lot of labor, time, and energy from members prior to the parade, with staff trying to ensure that our access needs would be met, on the day of, our access needs were ignored, dismissed, and trampled on. We continued to attempt to address the issues within the organization. Eventually, their executive director told us that accessibility was not a priority. The members of Chronically Queer voted to leave that organization as it truly wasn't representing the needs and full identities of group members. Chronically Queer came under the umbrella of creating Accessible Neighbourhoods. Once that transition took place, we heard from many people who said that they'd never contacted Chronically Queer because it was under an organization's umbrella where they faced exclusion, inaccessibility, and ableism. They didn't want to belong to a group that belonged to an organization that had been dismissing a part of them for years. Unfortunately, that organization is not alone in only representing certain demographics within their membership. For too long, disabled people, among others, have not been properly acknowledged, heard, or represented. The exclusion is particularly frustrating when it happens by an organization or individual who says they are working on behalf of a marginalized population, but are ignoring those within their own community with multiple intersecting identities that are additionally marginalized. Creating Accessible Neighborhoods is committed to creating welcome, equitable spaces and opportunities where the full person is respected, represented, and celebrated. Harmony Bongat, a member of Chronically Queer and facilitator and researcher for CAN, says that Chronically Queer under CAN's umbrella fosters a sense of community togetherness, bringing together queers who truly need support, advocacy, friendship, and connections. CAN makes it easier to hold space by doing their best to ensure that everyone's needs are met, thus validating the needs we as queer, disabled, colored, and or marginalized folk have. Creating Accessible Neighborhoods has been part of the Burnaby Pride Organizing Committee since its second year in 2018. CAN's executive director was Burnaby Pride's first chair for 2020 to 2021 and remains as co-chair. This slide has an image of drag performer Kendall Gender in front of the audience sitting on the grass at the 2019 Burnaby Pride event. As a new Pride organization, Burnaby Pride has the wonderful opportunity to create events that properly represent the many identities within the rainbow alphabet of 2S LGBTQIA+. For too long, many people have not felt represented by Pride events. Burnaby Pride has prioritized diversity and is utilizing an intersectional lens. In 2019, CAN was hired by Vancouver Pride Society to do accessibility audits of 7 of their Pride events. CAN performed the audits looking for opportunities for growth and improved accessibility for a broad range of people with a variety of disabilities and intersecting identities. We submitted reports on what barriers need to be reviewed and removed. We made suggestions for immediate change as well as some long-term changes that require more funding, cultural shifts, and/or resources that will take longer. Creating Accessible Neighborhoods also delivered disability awareness session to staff, volunteers, and some board members. And some of the reports that we have created for that project have been shared with Pride organizations throughout Canada. In 2020, CAN continued our working relationship with Vancouver Pride Society by facilitating community consultations to find out what Vancouver Pride Society is doing right, what they can improve, and why people may feel not welcome or included at Pride events. In 2021, Vancouver Pride Society provided CAN with a grant towards the research and creation of 2 new workshops that we are launching this month, Queer and Trans History BC and Queer and Trans History Canada. These workshops will be released during Pride season. CAN has also partnered with Vancouver Pride Society to create a timeline of queer and trans history that will be housed on Vancouver Pride Society's website. In 2019, CAN did a year-long board diversity project. This project was born out of a frustration of organizations that say they represent certain demographics who have nobody of that population in positions of power, leadership, or decision-making. This slide has an image of a boardroom surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows. We wanted to work towards pairing diverse people with boards. Our original goal was to create a database of qualified candidates to match with boards. We spent the year talking to a variety of people, including those who had decades of board experience, those currently on boards, those new to boards, those considering joining boards, those who don't see themselves as board materials, and staff who interact with their organization's boards. By the end of the year, we realized that no matter how qualified and suitable our candidates would be, until the environments of boards change, there will continue to be a tokenization, exclusion, and lack of true participation from those who have multiple intersecting identities. We decided to pivot to education. We recognize that boards need education about gender and sexuality and disability, among other identities. We also recognize that many people with marginalized identities feel like imposters in leadership roles and positions of power. This is the direct result of systems of power, even though it feels like an individual issue. Until there is a better understanding and knowledge about those pushed to the margins, board environments will continue to be problematic. So we created the following workshops: disability awareness, disability justice, gender and sexuality, and imposter syndrome. This slide has an image of a diverse group of disabled people of different heights, ages, body sizes, races, and other demographics. CAN has been doing disability awareness workshops for over 10 years. We have populated our workshops with lived experience. 1 in 5 people in the world's population, 20%, self-identify as having some form of disability. In Canada, 25% of non-Indigenous people identify as disabled, while 30 to 35% of Indigenous people identify as having a disability. This represents the world's largest minority. People with disabilities are also the 3rd largest economic power behind China and the United States. And keep in mind that due to stigma and prejudice, this number is not a true reflection because there are many who are not counted as they don't currently self-identify. It's vital that there is more awareness and education about disabled people. We're not a small portion of the community. We are at least a quarter. Our workshop covers what disability is, how ableism shows itself, and how to fight it, including internalized ableism that disabled people often weaponize against ourselves. This slide has a photograph of an empty university classroom. In 2020, there was a lot of interest and discussion about academic ableism, and it was our most popular workshop. Disabled students and staff have been fighting for years to have access and been denied. Then the pandemic happened and non-disabled people needed access, and suddenly classes were available online, proving that accessibility is possible, but that it is only made available for certain populations. This led to a lot of interest in extended conversations, and last year, academic ableism was the workshop that we did the most, and it was a spin-off of the disability awareness workshop. The term disability justice was created in 2005 from conversations between Black, Brown, queer, and trans people, including Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret, in reaction to their exclusion from the mainstream disability movement and studies, and the focus on straight white males with physical disabilities. Our workshop covers the 10 principles of disability justice created by the organization Sins Invalid. We have multiple versions of this workshop, a 1-hour introduction to the 10 principles, a 2-hour version that is both disability awareness and disability justice, and a 2-hour workshop on how to apply a disability justice framework to one's work. This slide has a photograph of a conference room full of participants at one of our workshops. Jessica Johns, the managing editor of Room, programming director of Growing Room Literary Festival, said the Intro to Disability Justice workshop held by Heather McCain was one of the most thought-provoking, in-depth, and necessary workshops I've ever taken. Heather grounded teachings on disability justice in the context of systems of oppression created by colonialism and held firm solidarity with Indigenous, Black, and people of color. In addition to creating a welcoming and judgment-free space, Heather seemed to create the workshop with a care for themselves, their community, and all the participants involved. The workshop wasn't a box to check in allyship. The workshop was instead empowering in its transformative call to action. It left me feeling like I had the tools to ask questions, dig deeper, and do the work in my own life and organization to prioritize accessibility and inclusion in an intentional and meaningful way. Imposter syndrome is feeling inadequate, feeling like you aren't qualified to do the work you're doing, or feeling like you might be discovered as a fraud. A person with imposter syndrome experiences self-doubt and often attributes their success to luck or people overestimating their abilities. People with imposter syndrome also tend to downplay, discount, or minimize their abilities and achievements. This slide has a row of illustrated people of different ages, races, disabilities, religions, and other varied demographics. Imposter syndrome is widespread. One study found 70% of respondents experienced it at one point in their life. It's something that many of us feel, whether we are a student new to our field or a highly accomplished person. There are ways to reduce the feelings of imposter syndrome and address the voices in our heads that tell us to doubt ourselves and our work. Imposter syndrome comes from internalized messaging that we don't always realize we're taking in. Our workshop covers some of these methods. We also talk about how imposter syndrome is not just a personal problem, but one based on who gets to be in power and define success. Kelly Braun Johnson, keynote speaker, author, and advocate of chief experience officers and leaders transform company culture to be more inclusive and accessible to all, said, I had the great pleasure of attending an amazing workshop on imposter syndrome presented by Heather McCain, they, them, executive director of Creating Accessible Neighborhoods this afternoon. It wasn't just about imposter syndrome. The content covered the experience of imposter syndrome from an oppressed, marginalized, intersectional, social justice, anti-colonialist, disability justice, and trauma-informed viewpoint. It was informative, validating, and empowering. Having people with lived experience share their knowledge heals communities, and this is how change happens. Kudos for the work you're doing, Heather, and I encourage everyone to check out their upcoming workshops. This slide has a colorful illustration of a diverse group of people in front of a large rainbow flag, and some of them are waving smaller flags. Creating Accessible Neighborhoods is committed to creating safer spaces for people from marginalized populations. However, we also recognize the importance of creating safer spaces for those who are curious and interested to learn more about marginalized identities. In this workshop, people are welcome from whatever level of knowledge of gender and sexuality they have. While we cover each of the letters of the rainbow alphabet to us LGBTQIA+, our main focus is the people, their stories. We aim to move away from having a hyper focus on the language. Language is constantly shifting, expanding, being updated by new generations and new awareness and understanding. The language also often intimidates people who are new to or learning about gender and sexuality. What we want to focus on is that our communities are more than language. We are people, your neighbors, your coworkers, your family, your friends. We're the people who have stories, histories, desires, connection, and love. This slide has a photo of the pride flag being held high in front of a courthouse. We are currently finalizing our work on 2 new workshops for Pride season, Queer and Trans History BC and Queer and Trans History Canada. These 2 workshops cover 70+ years of history and strides forward for queer and trans folk. Learn about how the people and organizations that fought for and secured the rights, freedoms, and protections we currently hold. We also highlight some of the rights and protections that we are still fighting for today. CAN also educates by speaking on panels, which offers the opportunity to have a dialogue with fellow speakers in an audience. Recent panels have included Overcoming Digital Divides, Speaking on Built Environment, and Let's Talk Stigma Reduction, which brought together people from various organizations working to reduce stigma. Upcoming panels include Queer and Trans Conversations about Disability Leadership, Our Voices Identifying as Queer and Living with a Disability, and Addiction Through a Human Rights Lens. CAN is proud of how far we have come these past 16 years. We take even more pride in how we are perceived by those we admire and respect. Cicely Blaine Bell, CEO of Bacau Consulting, is noted for founding Black Lives Matter Vancouver and was listed by Vancouver Magazine in 2018 and 2020 as one of Vancouver's 50 most powerful people. Cicely said the following of CAN: "I am so grateful to have witnessed the work of creating accessible neighborhoods. It is an incredibly necessary organization that is transforming the way we think about accessibility and disability justice in Vancouver and beyond. Every business, organization, and community can benefit from the important work they are doing to change systems, communities, and organizational culture. CAN's work serves to eliminate barriers to access in a way that is approachable, inclusive, and sustainable. I've had the pleasure of working directly with Heather to bring some visionary projects to life, and I'm constantly inspired by their patience, wisdom, integrity, and passion for this important work." Thank you for your time. On this slide is CAN's contact information and logo. Our website is www.canbc.org, and our email is info@canbc.org. And now we can open up if anybody has any questions. Well, thank you to Angela for inviting me to speak today. And this information will be on the YouTube page. Yeah. Oh, it looks like we might have something in the chat box. I sent some questions by email. Angela, do you have those?
Robin, which email did you send them to? Just by curiosity.
I've got the chat line.
Because you might have sent them to, I don't know if you sent them to Emily Chamber. If so, I will have to message her to get them.
I don't know how to do it.
Okay, Robin, I will check on that. Angie, if you want to ask a question vocally, you can go ahead and do so.
How can we get better with the human resources?
Human resource, you mean like in a workplace?
Yeah.
And how can human resources improve accessibility and equity?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things that human resources can do, but a big thing is education within the workplace. So having information about the various identities that people have. So that can be having a disability, being racialized, being queer and trans. Having education within the workplace is really important because often when there is, say, a disabled person in the workplace, that one person is expected to answer all these questions about that experience, and it puts a lot of pressure on their shoulders, and they might not necessarily know the answers. So it's important for workplaces to support their staff by having education that the entire group receives, and that's top to bottom too, because often it'll be people in human resources will get the training, but management won't, and it's really important that it goes through everybody. And that is always a very good first step. And then it depends on the work environment as to what else that they can do. Having an accessibility audit of the workspace is important to understand where there are things that can be improved for the accessibility of staff, as well as, you know, whatever customers that they may have, depending on what the business is. And another thing that they can do is to look at their own, evaluate their policies, look for ableist language, look for language that might be marginalizing people or no longer be current. And that's an important thing to do every couple of years. So those are all things that human resource can do.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. And so I see here from Robin, I'll ask here, first was about accessible portable toilets. Is there such a thing? City of Victoria cut off access to main toilet block within a large park and said they will mitigate the barrier with wheelchair accessible portables. Seems outrageous, but doesn't meet a standard. No ability to wash hands. So yeah, what is currently available are wheelchair accessible porta potties. And so you can get a mobility device, a standard mobility device, and some of the larger ones you can't get in there. And they have grab bars in there. They have a raised toilet seat. So there are accessibility standards that are met within those porta potties. And typically, if the city chooses, they can also get a sink that is put right next to the porta potties. And that's for people who can to wash their hand. Unfortunately, what is often supplied is a foot powered sink. And so people who are in wheelchairs who have no use of their legs would not be able to use those sinks. And so that's definitely not an accessible standard that has been met with those sinks. And it is an additional cost, so it's often not ordered. The second question is how to get media coverage. I send in story ideas and the local newspaper never bites. This can be quite difficult because they really want something that has a real hook in their stories. And so I have found that it's important to kind of look at specific writers, see what they're writing about, and appeal to that interest. So I often will read a lot of their previous articles before I send something in so that I can see what it is that they really like to write about. I also say start with some of the smaller newspapers. I know often people send media coverage into the big ones like the Sun and the Province, but we have a lot of smaller ones in Burnaby. There's the Burnaby Beacon, which is a newsletter instead of a newspaper, but it goes out to people's email box every Monday. And so you're getting a lot of people who would read it. There are a lot of smaller newspapers who are interested in stories. I think one of the things is that when you send in your ideas for the stories, it's good to kind of have bullet point of what it is you're wanting them to cover within the story. And then it's also just developing relationships. So keeping in touch with certain people who have written stories about you that you liked to make sure that they know you're still around and doing work that they could do coverage on. So those are some suggestions. And then we have Angela says, thank you, Robin, for pasting the questions here. Sorry about that. I'll see if we can change the invite email to be one easier to access. So thanks for that, Angela. And thank you for those questions. Are there any other questions?
No.
Gina?
Oh, can you hear me?